Hello, my name is China, Guangdong, Korea. Welcome to the Asian Environmental Club. Today the members and I will be discussing China's air pollution problem. So, first of all, let's discuss the general facts about China.
Hello. Well, I know so far that China's air pollution problem is indeed very bad, and there is certainly a lot of evidence to prove it. I know that according to Time magazine, the two most polluted cities in the world are Linfen and Chennai, which are both in China. I also know that China produces about 20% of the total pollution in the world.
That's a good start. But along with this problem are new innovations that the Chinese are creating, such as electric or hybrid cars, alternative fuels, and reducing emissions overall. According to an NPR article, a Chinese agency can determine what chemicals are in the air based on the color of the smog in China.
I did hear something about that. Apparently if the color is dark red, that means sulfur dioxide is present.
Yes, but the problem creating that are these inefficable stoves and heaters that often produce fluoride and arsenic. They said that if China's citizens did not use these stoves, then their total pollution could potentially drop by 60%.
Wow, that sounds pretty hopeful. Anyways, I read that the Vice Minister of the Ministry of China's Environmental Protection Agency that in China's 12th five-year plan, they intend to enforce total emissions control, which will drastically reduce the amount of carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and sulfur dioxide emissions.
Yes, and along with that, China's State Environmental Protection Administration says that a new cap-and-trade system should be put in place to lower emissions. Their vice president said that a new framework of policies will consist of 7 main concepts, including environment taxation, emissions taxation, and ecological taxation. China also plans on creating national reservation parks to protect the environment.
Yes, but the key factor is that authorities and officials are able to enforce these new laws.
That is true. One thing I read about when the Beijing Olympics occurred was that many of the athletes suffered from their lungs, and they said they felt a burning sensation.
Well, China did try and drastically make China cleaner in time for the Olympics by creating stricter driving regulations and closing factories.
Yes, they did. Well, our next topic is the history of China's pollution, and hopefully by examining the country's past, we can look for clues that can help us solve this problem. So, what do you know so far?
Well, I know that China's industrialization did not start in the 1800s like other countries. China only really started in the 1900s after being free from Japan, and especially after World War I. China during these times was being controlled through unfair trade systems and was not considered a world power.
Yes, that is all correct. China also suffered from famine and deforestation. The country was economically crippled and it could not compete in the world market. But China eventually did industrialize in 1949 when it finally became an industrial sector.
Right, China at this time was showing great progress.
Yes, and so by the 1950s, China was able to mass-produce missiles, and cars, boats, and planes. China was also able to exploit many of its natural resources and raw materials, including ores, minerals, and fuel sources including coal. China initiated its first 5-year plan in order to maximize labor and minimize costs by allowing many unemployed workers to work in factories and not modernize with machines. These reforms had been successful, and by the 1980s, China was producing 25 times more goods than they were in the 1950s.
So, then China was able to sell many of its goods to foreign consumers, which allowed China to stock up on a huge amount of foreign money.
Right again. But even though China was doing so well, consumer demand increased, and even by the 1980s, China was still 15 years behind in technological advances. So they created research divisions and started to become a leading country in technology. China was also refining and producing about 131 million tons of coal.
So China was really developing fast over the past 30 years, and so the price for it was their environment?
Unfortunately, yes. In China today, over 70% of the population has their own reserves of coal in which they use for personal uses, and China also produces a lot of electricity. This puts an enormous strain on the environment, as there is an estimated 3 trillion tons of coal left in China's untapped reserves. China also exports many precious metals and raw materials.
So, all this has led to the 300% rise in the gross domestic product of China and the 373% increase in energy consumption.
Yes, and without China's daily need and sustenance for coal, then I fear that they will run out and then they will collapse. But moving on, let us discuss the response to this crisis. What do you know about the agencies that are working against this pollution?
Well, I know at least about the World Health Organization, or WHO for short. According to the WHO, 16 of the 20 most polluted cities are in China, and that every year over 656,000 people die from air pollution-related diseases, as well as over 2 million premature deaths every year. I also think that the WHO donates about $40 billion in aid to China to help them combat air pollution.
Yes, and they also help a large number of other countries with the same thing, but there are other agencies such as China's Environment Forum and the Hoffman Environmental Institute of Kentucky University. Many of these agencies and groups are part of China's Environmental Health Project, which basically has a main goal of cleaning the air and water in China. They know that the decline in air quality will do harm, so they have decided to act.
Yes, and now I remember another group called the Clean Air Initiative for Asian Cities. This group, as I recall, works closely with the government of China in order to exercise and maintain environmental policies, and they also train future representatives to work in larger agencies such as the WHO.
That is cool. I bet you don't know about the Ministry of Environmental Protection for the People's Republic of China. This agency checks and makes daily reports on the air quality of over 200 cities in China, and according to the WHO, over 90% of those cities are below satisfactory standards. Then there is another agency called the European Union, which works on China's air quality and says that only about 560 million people in China breathe clean air out of a population that has over 1 billion people.
That is a disturbing fact.
Yes, it is. Well, since we are pressed for time, let us move on to the last topic. We are now going to discuss the possible damages and future of China. So what is your opinion so far, based on any knowledge you learned or knew from today or before?
Well, in order to figure out what the government is truly doing, we need to know their annual budget, which is on average about $150 billion, and only 10% of it is used for cleaning the environment. Also, China has a GDP of $4.9 trillion. It has the third largest economy, falling short of both Japan and the United States.
Right, and China's economy revolves around its exploitation of natural resources, most non-renewable, meaning that once they are depleted, China will not be able to sustain itself, as China's population already depends on coal too much.
And also, China's pollution is spreading to other countries including Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines.
Yes, and since China's resources will eventually run out, they have already begun research on hydroelectric power, and have already spent $24 billion on building the Three Gorges Dam, which is on the Yangtze River.
Yes, this will definitely help. But what happens if this fails, and China's economy falls?
Well, if China falls, the United States would cancel all contracts with China, and cease any negotiations until China had regained its former self. It would be quite disastrous.
So, if both countries are working together to avert a disaster, it is potentially strengthening diplomatic relationships, and also saving the world in a sense.
Yes, and now finally, we will talk about the citizens of China who are forced to endure such a tragic time.
I've read that unnatural amounts of cancer patients have emerged, ranging from ages as low as 4 to as high as 75, and local residents and villagers are blaming it on air pollution and the chemicals that are being dumped into their waters.
Yes, and even people with no relation to certain diseases are getting them without knowing why.
Wow. I remember reading another article about how the poor people of China cannot afford enough clean drinking water for their family and are forced to give it to their children, and the parents themselves are forced to drink the toxic sludge-like water.
This is just appalling. I also know that many villagers have filed lawsuits against chemical companies, but that seldom works, and even petitions do not work.
That is incredible and scary at the same time.
Yes. Well, that concludes our meeting today, and I will post our next meeting later.
Bye.
See you later.